So we're going to get started. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Katie West, she and hers. I'm the Strategic Initiatives Manager with the Housing Network of Rhode Island, and we are pleased to have you join this webinar, Innovative Land Use Policies in New England, which is adapted from the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston. Just a couple quick notes. As I mentioned earlier, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, organization, pronouns. We are going to ask that folks use the Q&A feature if you have a question for one of the panelists. And the chat is open, but just ask that folks use that judiciously and, of course, keep a respectful dialogue. We all appreciate that. I am now going to turn it over to Kathleen Amonte from Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston to welcome everybody, and we'll get started. And just so folks are aware, we are recording this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Good afternoon and welcome to the Innovative Land Use Policy discussion. As Katie said, I'm Kathleen Amonte. I'm a Senior Community Investment Manager in the Housing and Community Development Department of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston. For those of you who don't know, the Federal Home Loan Banks were created by an act of Congress 90 years ago. And the mission is to support housing finance along with affordable housing and economic growth. This is done through products and services that we offer to our members. And the bank's membership, the Boston Bank's membership, consists of over 400 financial institutions in New England, which include commercial banks, thrifts, credit unions, CDFIs, and insurance companies. The bank is also charged with convening groups to discuss issues around housing and economic development. And I'd like to thank Housing Network Rhode Island for continuing this important conversation around land use policies in New England. This has been an important topic for our advisory council, which culminated into a forum this past September, and we're happy to have been approached to bring this discussion to Rhode Island. We're all aware we face a chronic housing shortage and worsening affordability crisis. Current land use policies here in New England are often impediments to development of housing. Bringing attention to this issue and working to revisit zoning policies is one step to being able to develop more housing opportunities. So you all here to listen to the panelists, not me, so it is my pleasure to hand the program over to Sharon Morris, who is also a member of our advisory council here at the bank, along with Erin Cooperrider, who you'll be hearing from later. Sharon's also the executive director of Omni Development Corp in Providence, Rhode Island. And here's to you, Sharon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's event. And I am happy to be able to share this very important topic with the residents and developers in Rhode Island. Rhode Island's Low and Moderate Income Housing Act was first enacted in 1991, and it calls for at least 10% of the housing supply in Rhode Island municipalities to be classified as affordable, up to 80% AMI for rental homes and 120% for home ownership. And Rhode Island only 6 out of the 39 communities meet the goal, and those 6 communities are Burrville, Central Falls, Newport, New Shoreham, Providence, and Woonsocket. The Rhode Island governor and the state legislator in Rhode Island has made a commitment to investing in affordable housing. So my question to all of you in attendance today is maybe when you listen to the presenters, we should see what's working in the other regions, what's working in New England. Every presenter represents a different community. So I'm hoping something that they share today will allow you to be open to trying to see what you can do in your community as it relates to zoning and land use. What does that look like in your community? It really depends. It's really not a one size fits all. What works in Providence may not work in Burrville. It may not work in Newport, but just being open to seeing what possibilities may be available to you to help develop affordable housing in your communities. And also just wanted you to basically think about how we can accomplish developing affordable housing, affordable home ownership in your town. There is a lot of work that needs to be done in Rhode Island. And it's my hope that the remaining 33 communities understand that everyone has a role to creating affordable housing opportunities in the state. So again, there's no one size fits all. So I hope something that is said by our panelists today will open the door to you creating housing opportunities in your community. Next up, we will hear from Rachel Heller, who is the CEO of CHAPA, which is the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, which is located in Massachusetts. CHAPA's mission is advocating for opportunities, expanding access to housing, and developing the field of housing. So if you can please turn your attention to Rachel, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I am truly honored to speak alongside people I admire and to talk about one of my favorite things, land use policy. I warn you now that I can get very enthusiastic about this and I can go on and on. I will warn our host to mute me if I go over my allocated time. First, I just want to thank you all for joining today to talk about housing and land use policy. While not everyone is directly involved in these issues, everyone should be. Land use, zoning laws, and public and private investments shape our communities, and the choices that we make determine who can live in our communities and who can't. And this impacts the future of our communities, our states, and our region. You might recall back in 2020, then Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, announced the administration would be ending affirmatively furthering fair housing regulations, referring to them as a waste of time for localities to comply with. This came weeks after then President Trump said these regulations would abolish the suburbs. While the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulations are now safely back in place and provide an important structure in which our states and communities address housing discrimination and segregation, it's important that we recognize the importance of actively assessing racial and economic disparities and work together to build a future where everyone has safe, healthy, affordable homes in thriving communities. The Federal Fair Housing Act provides a critical framework. Our states can establish requirements and incentives and provide public financing. And ultimately, our communities determine zoning, land use, what gets built, and for whom. Our future is cultivated by us. Throughout New England, we flourish when our neighborhoods and the communities we love flourish. To ensure this future of the places and the people that we love, we need to cultivate our shared strength. And now is the time for collective action. The urgent impacts of the pandemic and damaging legacy of racial injustice are putting our entire region's future at risk. Will we look back in 20 years and find that we cemented unjust policies and discrimination into place? Or will we come together and lead ourselves to a thriving tomorrow by investing in the places that we love? The decisions that we make today will determine our future. And right now, housing is the single best investment every community across the region can make to secure the future that we all want and deserve. A diverse mix of homes in every community plants the seeds for our long-term success. It protects our environment, improves our overall health, strengthens our economy, and can build wealth for everyone. When we seed our success by investing in housing affordability, that means that children can live near their grandparents, coffee shops have staff and customers, factories have workers, people can buy homes in the communities where they grew up, entrepreneurs can take a chance, and young families can build a future. Unfortunately, opportunities to thrive have been withheld from so many families, especially families of color, through exclusionary policies and practices that have truly drained our collective strength. To get the future we want, we can and we must do things differently. In Massachusetts, we are fortunate to have a wide range of tools to invest in affordable housing. We have our landmark affordable housing law, Chapter 40B, which requires every community have 10% of our housing stock affordable to people with incomes below 80% of the area median income. We have our own stock of public housing and our own state rental assistance programs. We have our own state low-income housing tax credit and several programs that provide financing for affordable housing production and preservation. Yet even with all of these tools that were created at the state level, we have had a decline over the last 30 years in production. And while the state is doing more and more to encourage housing production, you cannot build what is not allowed. We now build half the amount of homes that we did in the 1980s, and home prices and rents have gone from on average with the rest of the country to ranking within the top 5 on nearly every study. To address this, our legislature and the governor prioritized housing and passed legislation last year that makes 3 monumental changes. 1, it requires half the state to zone for multifamily housing by right that is suitable for families with children and near transit. 2, we now have a lowered threshold for voting for when every community votes to upzone. It's now been lowered to a simple majority from a 2/3 requirement that we had in place before. And 3, the new law allows judges to require that abutters post a bond of up to $50,000 for lawsuits that are filed in order to delay or prevent housing development. Our Secretary of Housing and Economic Development describes these policies as good for the economy, good for sustainability, and good for affordability. And while these laws are incredibly impactful and provide communities with the opportunity to replace our exclusionary land use policies with more inclusive development, many more tools will be needed in order to provide the homes that people need to thrive. Now is the time we need to do all the things and use our 4 Ps. That is production, preservation, planning, and really this is all about people. So in terms of production, in Massachusetts, we need to produce 200,000 new homes by the end of the decade. We need at least 40,000 of these homes to be affordable and 20,000 of them to be deeply affordable for people with extremely low incomes. Production alone will not solve our problems. We also cannot solve our problems without production. In terms of preservation, we need to preserve the affordable and public housing we've got, and we need to preserve people's ability to stay in their neighborhoods. And when it comes to planning, we need to plan for more homes. And ultimately, like I said, this is really about people. Everything we do is about the people and people's ability to live in the communities they choose. For too long, zoning has kept people out, focused investment in select neighborhoods and municipalities, and limited opportunity for so many people. Now is the time that we can right this ship. We should listen to people when they say what they need and support the production of homes that allow people to stay in their communities, invite people in who have been kept out, and foster vibrancy in all of our neighborhoods. I have a lot more than I can say, but like I told you, I can go on and on. So I'm going to turn this over now to Erin Cooper-Ryder. Erin is an experienced affordable housing developer and policy advocate working to expand housing choice and ensure communities are livable for all. Erin.
Thank you, Rachel. And hello, everybody. I'm actually sitting in Boston today, although I work in Maine. But I'm lucky enough to be here today with Kathleen and others on the advisory council, which is meeting in the other room. And it's my job today just to introduce you this first panel. We've got 3 speakers for you from 3 different states. And I think what you'll hear is a demonstration of 3 different state level approaches to land use reform. Our first presenter, Katie Lacey from the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. It's a quasi-public state agency that finances affordable rental housing, provides loans for first-time homebuyers, provides technical assistance for housing and neighborhood development, and is a major contributor to state housing policy. And what we will hear from Massachusetts is probably the most fully baked approach of the 3 that you're going to hear about today. Our second presenter is Ryan Fecteau, Speaker of the House, the Maine House of Representatives. I had the great good fortune to be working with Ryan and one of the panelists in our next panel on the Commission to Increase Housing Opportunity in Maine by studying zoning and land use restrictions. And so he is going to talk to you about some legislation that resulted from the work of that commission. I think we're really, really fortunate in Maine to have Speaker Fecteau. He's an inspirational leader and a dynamic speaker and passionate about affordable housing, which is what we all need in our legislatures. And then we'll hear from Erin Boggs from the Open Communities Alliance. She's in Connecticut, and Erin has been working on issues of equity, particularly in the context of housing, for almost 20 years. And she is the executive director of the Open Communities Alliance. So we'll start today with Katie.
Hi, my name is Katie Lacey. Thank you for that great intro. I think you covered everything on this slide. So I'm here today to talk about a newly enacted 2021 Massachusetts state law that requires the 175 cities and towns served by the MBTA, otherwise known as the MBTA communities by statute, to designate reasonably sized districts that allow multifamily housing at right at a density of 15 units an acre near transit. So that's a mouthful. By way of background, I think Rachel actually did a great service in covering this. We are one of the most expensive housing markets in the US. Our home prices have increased tenfold since 1980. And our level of production is about 40% below the national average. We have very low vacancy rates, and it looks like we're about 50,000 units short of necessary housing. And our housing costs result from insufficient housing supply, caused largely by local zoning and other land use regulations that typically discourage density and promote large-scale single-family homes, which isn't what anyone thinks they're getting, but it's what they're going to end up getting. We did some research here at MHP, our Center for Housing Data, and found out that the average housing density around MBTA stations, which include rapid transit, commuter rail, and then adjacent communities by statute, is 6 units an acre, which is extremely low for the investment that the state's putting in. And that just increasing this to 10 units an acre would add another 250,000 units of housing. I'm going to just go off script here and see if I can show you a little movie that we are now premiering. So if I can ask you to let me share my screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, I think I can share. Okay. Can everyone hear this?
We all love Massachusetts, but finding a place to live is close to impossible.
We're not seeing the video though.
We don't build enough homes.
Okay, let's try that again.
So Katie, you need to unshare.
You
So
did
stop
share
sharing.
the screen, right?
It is, but what we see is your desktop. So if you stop sharing and then share again and select just the screen.
Well, maybe we will skip that. It's a very cute video, but if I swore to Katie that if this was not seamless, we would just move on to the next thing. So anyway, so now I'm not sharing. I'll talk to you a little bit about this law. The MBTA community zoning law was, oh, there we go, the law itself was characteristically terribly short with very little detail. So the monumental task of developing more detailed guidelines on how to interpret this was sent to a multi-agency group, including folks from our Executive Office of Environmental Affairs, the Department of Housing and Community Development, Department of Transportation, Mass Housing Partnership. And after 18 months, including the issuance of 2 rounds of preliminary guidance and extensive public comment, the final guidelines were released in August 2022. So the guidelines are intended to clearly interpret the intent of the law and its implications for the communities in a way that's responsive to the wide variety of communities covered under this law. So we have large cities and little teeny towns that are classified as MBTA communities. We want to make sure that we respond to the different needs of the different size communities, but also ensure that every community does its part, which honestly has not happened in the past in some of our communities. We've noticed that some communities have been very great about allowing a lot of housing, and others have really taken active steps to prevent the construction of new housing. So just as a quick caveat too, this is not technically an affordable housing program, it's a production program. There are provisions in there that allow for affordable housing, but I think it's something important for this group to understand that at its heart, this was a production law. And, on the premise that increasing supply will hopefully at some point make a dent in cost. So they define as of right housing, as you all know, is multifamily housing allowed without the use of special permit, variance, zoning amendment, or anything other discretionary. So site plan review is allowed, so communities can get in there and sort of talk a little bit about what would be allowed in the district, but not in a discretionary way where they're voting up or down. It requires a minimum density of 15 units an acre. And the guidelines defined multifamily as buildings containing at least 3 units. So this is not high rises, guys. This is the missing middle. This starts at triplexes, which is triple deckers are famous around here, and they're not allowed barely anywhere, and goes all the way on up to multifamily buildings. In terms of making a determination of reasonable size, which was in the statute, this was the hard work. And the guidelines went into the details and identified a specific minimum land area and minimum multi-unit capacity for each one of the 175 units. So just to clarify, this is capacity allowed by zoning. It is not the number of units built. Units will never get counted. It doesn't really matter what's hovering around above, it's what's in the zoning. That's just a tough concept for a lot of people to get, and I understand why. The minimum land area for every community was 50 acres or 1.5% of the developable land in the community, whichever was less. And I want to assure you that the calculation of what constitutes developable drew on a really in-depth analysis of GIS data layers and an understanding of environmental and regulatory obstacles to development. The determination of what the number of units that should be permitted in each community was based on the type of transit available in that community. So in other words, rapid transit requires the most, commuter rail the next, adjacent communities the next, and then there was another category added that was adjacent small towns, and these were very small towns that really had minimal capacity to absorb new housing. The law also required that the district must be generally located within half a mile of stations when applicable, or otherwise encouraged in downtown or other smart growth locations. This also required quite a bit of interpretation because a lot of our commuter rail stations and rapid transit stations are surrounded by wetlands. The land just isn't developable. So the guidelines did an elaborate calculation of what was developable around the station area, and that factored in as well. The department, in close collaboration with MHP's Center for Housing Data and our consultants, RKG, developed a really remarkable compliance modeling tool, which uses geospatial database, draws on a geospatial database, zoning checklist, and unit capacity estimator. You may say, why did we do this? And this is a one size fits all. We've heard a lot of issues, but I think the concern is having the Department of Housing and Community Development staff be in the position of King Solomon saying, that's reasonable, that's not reasonable. It just wasn't cutting it. So we needed something that was a bit more quantitative that communities could put in when they wanted to see compliance with this law. And have it be a little more fair. I should add something I missed, which is that non-compliance would effectively mean that communities cannot apply for some very major sources of grant funding available in the Commonwealth. MassWorks, technical assistance grants. These are big grants that assist with utilities, et cetera. They did not touch schools and that kind of thing. But it does say they shall adopt it, and it does have consequences. So the model is very sophisticated in how it was built, but I will tell you, as someone that had no GIS training, it's really not that hard to use. And we are on a massive train the trainers campaign right now here at MHP to get as many consultants, our regional planning agencies, et cetera, up to speed on how to use it. We and the Department of Housing and Community Development are offering an unprecedented amount of direct technical assistance. Some of this is state money. At MHP, for instance, we got a very generous grant from the Barr Foundation for direct technical assistance and from the Department of Transportation. The deadlines for compliance begin as soon as a year from now for our rapid transit communities and extend to December 2025 for communities with no stations in their areas. So let's see, how am I doing on time here?
So Katie, you do need to wrap up. I am sure folks are going to have more specific questions for you
I
about
can't hear you.
implementation. Are you having trouble hearing me, Katie? Yeah.
Okay. Katie, I will wrap up.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, I'll just wrap up and say the two big hangups we've had is that the communities have grown very concerned about, are we supposed to be producing this housing? Because communities don't produce housing. Developers typically produce housing. And that's been a big hurdle. The other concern that the communities have had is, are we supposed to be paying for all the utilities for this stuff? And as with all private development, the answer is no. That is typically left to the developer to cover. So anyway, with that, I'll close. I'm sure you're gonna have questions, but that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Speaker Fecto, we'll move over to you and talk about new law in Maine.
Well, thanks, Erin, and thanks to the Housing Network of Rhode Island for having me. I am a former speaker as of 5 hours ago, so it's very kind that I am still permitted to participate in this way as an unemployed Mainer. So I really appreciate being part of the panel discussion today, and I wish my colleagues who have just been sworn in this morning all the greatest luck as they take on the next 2 years of their term, and I set off into the sunset. With that being said, I'm really happy to be here to discuss the work we did over the last year and a half to pass some landmark legislation reforming zoning and land use regulations in the state of Maine. I'm going to be very brief because I know we're over time already, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. So I'm just going to give a very quick rundown of the bill, and then I'll end it there. Real quickly, though, the landscape here in Maine is important to understand. 1 in 5 renters in Maine pay more than half of their income towards housing costs. Maine has the oldest housing stock in the nation, and our number one emission here in the state is the result of transportation, people commuting mostly to and from work. So these are important things to keep in mind as we discuss why it was so important to pass this bill here in our state. On average, here in Maine, we were building 250 units of affordable housing each year. The last 2 years, we have more than doubled that number of average production, a direct result of deliberate policy decisions being made at our state capitol. But we're still short of the 1,000 units that we need to build on an annual basis to maintain or to rather meet the demand that is out there. LD 2003 resulted from a commission. Erin referenced that commission earlier today, and you'll hear from Jeff Levine, who also served on that commission. In effect, the bill does a couple of things. First, it essentially eliminates single-family zoning in the state of Maine, and not in the sense that you can no longer build a single-family zone, but rather in the sense that no longer can a community say that this part of town is exclusively zoned for single-family housing only. The way we designed the bill is to say, if you have an empty lot where there's not a current structure on that lot, someone can buy that property and they can build up to 4 units. There are some restrictions when you get to 3 and 4 units based on where the project is located, particularly due to concerns with water and public sewer and water infrastructure. But at least a duplex could be built on any lot here in the state of Maine. So a +2 change as a result of this bill, and in some cases a +3 or a +4. In addition, we created a density bonus, which will allow up to 2.5 times the base density where multifamily housing is already allowed by communities. So increasing the number of units that can be built on a lot. And we also really reduce pretty much any barrier that would be in place preventing accessory dwelling units, otherwise known as in-law apartments, from being built. And so that is a very liberal permission now in the law. And we also prohibit communities from imposing growth caps on accessory dwelling units. So we have a few communities here in the state that have growth caps in place where only X number of units can be built in any given year. No longer will accessory dwelling units count towards that growth cap. We also passed some language around affirmatively furthering the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act, as it relates to zoning, making sure that zoning is in compliance with the principles within that act, and also the Maine Human Rights Act as well. So, which has some different provisions in some instances from the federal legislation. That is a very quick, generalized rundown of the bill. We also created an incentive program that will hopefully get communities to take up some of the work that we didn't address in this legislation. But it was a difficult process with a lot of stakeholders, and definitely still requiring a great deal of work, as many of the provisions take effect on July 1st of 2023. And so communities right now are going through the process of reviewing their ordinances, making sure they come in compliance ahead of the July 1st date. And as you can imagine, there is certainly been a lot of pushback, but we're trying to get to a place where communities are proactively adopting this policy and making sure that we can start to chip away at the significant underproduction that we're experiencing here in the state of Maine. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Erin.
Thank you, Ryan. That was terrific. So we're gonna turn to Erin and have her talk to us about their efforts in Connecticut. And then following that, we'll take some questions for the first panel. Erin.
Great to see everyone. And you see some information here about Open Communities Alliance and a little bit about my background. We definitely come to these issues from a racial equity framework. We also are thinking very much about the actual need for affordable housing. And so if you can go to the next slide, I can just jump right into it. For the past 2 years, we've put forth a bill called Fair Share Planning and Zoning. We came to this proposal because we know there's this incredible need for affordable housing in the state. As others have shared in this region overall, obviously we have some real housing challenges, both in terms of segregation and affordability. We do have a builder's remedy law here already. It's been on the books since for 30 years, since 1989. And we love it. It's important. We need it, but we need to do more. Right now, under this law, which has a sort of 10% threshold, only 18% of the towns have 10% of their housing stock that's affordable. And the way they define what housing counts, 1-bedrooms count, studios count, senior housing counts. All of those are important things, but it's not helping us get to the kind of housing that's really missing from our housing market, particularly housing that is for families that has 2, 3, 4 bedrooms, and that maybe is handicap accessible, has some supportive elements to it. And deeply affordable housing is also really absent from our market. And what we realized is that we need about 135,000 units of affordable housing, and I'll explain how we got to that number. If all the towns that are not attaining 10% under our current law, and again, that's actually sort of a toggle on-off threshold, it's not really a goal, but everyone thinks of it as a goal. And if they really did attain 10%, we'd only have about 41,000 units. So we'd be still short about 100,000 units. So we know we need to do more. We know we need to change the way people are thinking about this, because particularly the wealthier suburban towns are very, very focused on that 10% number, which is not productive in the long run to getting us where we need to go. So we created a consortium of organizations called Growing Together Connecticut. There are about 45 plus organizations that have joined up now. And what we are advancing is this fair share planning and zoning model that grew out of the Mount Laurel cases in New Jersey. We're also matching that with a set of policies that are designed to help cities. So both in terms of equitable policy change around tenant protections, but also in terms of investments in places that already have a lot of very low income housing. If you can move to the next slide, that'd be great. So what Fair Share does is it has really 5 basic steps. It first determines the need for affordable housing, and we've used a very conservative way to estimate that need by looking at the number of households in the state that is paying more than half of its income towards housing costs and earning no more than $30,000 a year, or 30% of AMI, which is about $30,000 a year for a family of 4. I say that's conservative because if you really looked at the standard definition of when housing becomes unaffordable, meaning a family's paying more than 30%, and if you apply that to families at 80% of AMI, for example, earning $80,000 a year for a family of 4, that's about 376,000 units that we would actually need. So by going with that lower number, really as a proxy for the need, we've come to something that is a little bit more conservative, but also meaningful. We then assign those numbers. First, we break them down by region in a fair way, and then out to towns in a fair way, looking at the percentage of poverty in the town, the percentage of multifamily housing, the town's median income, and the town wealth. So the wealthier the town, and by wealth, what we're talking about is the property taxes on commercial and residential property. So the property taxes, the town's wealth means, and lower levels of poverty, lower levels of multifamily housing means the town is able to do more and should be doing more. So they get a higher percentage. Then the bill includes technical assistance to towns. So it's really interesting to see and hear how Massachusetts is doing that. We'll maybe have to talk. And then each towns are required to engage in a municipal planning process. So they need to adjust their planning and zoning to accommodate this new fair share number, which can be reduced somewhat by providing the most urgently needed housing. So you might get double points, for example, if you have families with vouchers, or you might get double points for 2 and 3 bedrooms, et cetera. In New Jersey, this has worked incredibly well. Of course, it's been a long time in coming and required litigation, but right now, Fair Share there has generated about 170,000 deed restricted and affordable units, and naturally affordable units that are just more dense. And there are agreements in place with towns to produce another 150,000 units. In Connecticut, we estimate that sort of same kind of scenario would generate about 300,000 homes over the next decade, translate into $59 billion of new income for Connecticut residents, $12 billion in state and local taxes. just based on the market rate units alone. So this has huge potential, and given the challenges with the economy right now overall, and the way people are really feeling this, all kinds of costs in their pocketbook, this is something that a state can do, and not have to really try to control the war in Ukraine or any of the other national economic factors that are driving some of those cost increases, but they can really make this, a state can really make a difference when it comes to local land use. And that's all. Thank you.
So thank you, Erin and Ryan and Katie. What we have heard here is 3 different approaches at the state level to take a look at zoning, make some land use reforms that will encourage the development of affordable housing. I think one of our participants said this early on, but clearly it's not the state or the municipality that's creating the housing, it's housing developers. And so these are tools. We're looking at how to encourage that. I want to just put in a plug for the work that was done in Maine. There had been a number of efforts to make accessory dwelling units, ADUs, to push more development at that level. I think we all understand we don't have enough housing developers to get it all done. How are we going to do 134,000 units with the same, workforce we've got? So we need to make it possible for every man to contribute here. So for a rural state like Maine, ADUs make a lot of sense. But Maine's got 489. Ryan, you might jump in and correct me, or Jeff, if I overstated that, but we've got quite a lot of municipalities and a lot of rural areas. So what works in Maine may not work in other states, but there are pieces of this legislation that really, I think, are translatable to other locations. We're still in sort of the rulemaking phase now. Massachusetts is a lot farther ahead with their law. In Maine, the Department of Economic and Community Development just rolled out some guidelines for municipalities. And this work is sort of now being done at the municipal level, sort of figuring out how each individual land use ordinance needs to change. But I'm happy to report that a number of communities are saying 2.5 times, density bonus. Can we make it 3.5 or 4.5? How does that impact our community? And does it get us more of the housing we need faster? So happy to see that happening, and happy to see at least one question show up in our Q&A. So we just have a couple of minutes here, and then we're going to roll to the next panel. And obviously, whatever time we have left at the end, we'll take whatever questions come up at that point. From Scott Wolf, we have: how supportive or resistant have your state associations of municipalities and planners been to your proposals? So Katie, we'll start with you and then go to Ryan.
I would say the initial response was a little crazy, but it's amazing right now. We are offering technical assistance. Over half of the communities have sort of proactively stepped up and said, yeah, I think we have this. I think we have something that might work, and they've asked for technical assistance to explore it further. So we've also had some comments, why are you just limiting it to MassWorks funding? Why don't you cut other funding? But nonetheless, there still is a lot of opposition, particularly in our more affluent towns and in our smaller towns. So it's a mixed bag right now. I think it's going to take a while.
Okay, Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, I think the same similar scenario in Maine. We definitely have folks that remain oppositional to these policies. During the process, during the legislative process, we had planners who were enthusiastically supportive and actually very, very helpful in drafting the legislation. We also had planners who were involved that had different perspectives on words that should be used, we were certainly in the weeds, like deeply in the weeds on every word that was used in the legislation that ended up passing. And so that as a policymaker, that was certainly a little bit frustrating from my perspective, because it's, you're trying you're trying to like get the ball moving and get the bill to the finish line, and you are producing like 60 versions of the same bill because someone has a different perspective on what word should be used in a certain sentence. So that was fun. That was definitely an interesting process to go through. And there are planners that still remain, I think, pretty resistant. And so those are challenges that we will have to continue to overcome here in Maine. And the primary opposition, though, for our context was Maine Municipal Association, which represents city managers, city councils, town planning boards, and so forth across the state. And I think, they represent a very diverse, as Aaron said, we have, I think, a little over 500 communities in Maine. There are a lot of divergent interests and perspectives on how things should get done. So challenging.
So I'm going to let Aaron Boggs comment also. I think I would just tag on to Speaker Fecto's comments and add that, the Maine Municipal Association was represented on the commission. So they had a lot of input through the commission report into the legislation. And, we grappled the whole time with this concept of the state imposing land use regulations and how that impinges on local control. And ultimately, we did have the state office responsible for our Growth Management Act speak up and say that local control derives from state law to begin with. And so it's important to understand that the state will need to step in places where the issues extend beyond the borders of one town. And clearly we had lots of examples, and I'm sure folks on this webinar have also seen how what one town does impacts the town next door, the town down the road. So it clearly is something that needs to be tackled at the state level. Aaron Boggs, would you like to comment also?
Sure, and I'll try to do it quickly. I think we see a lot of I think growth among both planners and members of our Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. Certainly a greater willingness for different players to, on a personal level or in a private way, say that they're very supportive of this, and and that may be different from what some organization or group can do. We've gotten endorsement for fair share from the Connecticut Planners Association, so they've testified in support of this last year. And will continue to work and hopefully eventually partner with the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. We also have the Connecticut Organization of Small Towns. And if you like acronyms, that's COST. And it is expensive. And we haven't cracked that nut yet either.
So Katie West, I'm going to turn it back over to you. There are a couple of questions here, one from Becky Marcus and one from Greg Miller, which seem to me to speak more to the municipal level questions. And our next panel is our municipal level conversations. And so we will promise to come back to you at the end if your questions don't get answered. Katie?
Yes, thank you, Erin. We have time built in at the end of the webinar for questions, and we do want to move on to the next panel. Katie Gradowski has had a hand up for a while, so I just want to make sure, Katie, if you are able to type your question, that might be better if it's so we can make sure that we get to it. But I'll move on to the next set of panelists. And Erin, I'm happy to introduce them. Unless you would like to.
Go right ahead.
Okay, so joining us to talk about municipal innovations and solutions. So now that we've heard from folks who are working more at the state level, we have Chris Campany from Windham Regional Commission in Vermont and Jeff Levine of Levine Planning Strategies. So I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Chris. And Chris is the executive director of the Windham Regional Commission based in Brattleboro, which serves 27 towns in southeastern Vermont. and he will be speaking about some of the challenges that Vermont cities and towns have had, specifically related to infrastructure and what has been happening in that space. Thanks, Chris.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So thanks. As you can tell from my accent, I'm in southern Vermont. We in Vermont regional planning commissions, we're an essential link between local, state, and federal government, as we have no county government at all. Among our 27 towns, we cover about 920 square miles. It's about 10% of the total land area of the state of Vermont. Our largest town which is Brattleboro, has a population of 12,200, and our smallest town has a population of 6. That's Somerset. They actually doubled in population over the last census, so they're one of our fastest growing towns. Our mission is to assist towns to provide effective local governance and collaborate with them to address regional issues. For the last couple of decades, population growth in our region has been stagnant or on decline. But during the pandemic, we saw a relatively significant number of people moving to the state or occupying more fully their second homes. Now, in the Vermont context, it's interesting. We are clearly a rural state, but there are different shades of rural. And actually, some of our towns, especially Brattleboro, Bellows Falls, they actually have urban forms. They're fairly densely populated, have somewhat larger scale buildings. What we learned, of course, is that with our already low supply of available housing, it doesn't take many people coming to our region to have a big impact on housing availability, and then ultimately housing purchase costs, but also rental costs. And we don't have exact numbers, but generally speaking, properties from what I've seen, the sale prices went up like 25% or more. People are actually getting into bidding wars when oftentimes previously homes would be on the market for a month. And renters, in many cases, for a typical kind of housing in the middle apartment, are paying about what you would have normally expected to pay for a mortgage. But to the extent there's a silver lining in all this, and another issue too is that some renters have been displaced as people have moved in and converted what were multifamily homes, especially in some big old Victorian type houses, converted them back into single family homes. But if there's a silver lining to all this, there's near universal awareness of that housing scarcity affects everyone. Because now, especially as children wanted to move back to Vermont, or we have one of the oldest populations in the country, as people are looking to downsize, they're realizing there's really no place to go. Brattleboro alone did a housing study. They really compiled the data before really the folk who moved in during the pandemic shook out. But they identified that additional 500 units are needed right now. So we're in a situation whereby housing supply is far outstripped by demand. Being a small state, it doesn't take many people moving into and from out of state who can afford the housing that is available to make housing supply and affordability even more challenging for those already here. In very real practical terms, this means those who cannot find appropriate housing during different life stages, whether it's young people moving out of the family home for the first time, couples having children, empty nesters downsizing, loss of a spouse by death or divorce, seniors and others seeking housing to fit their independent living abilities. They find themselves having to consider leaving the state if they have the means to do so because they can't find the housing they need. For others, it could mean making do with less than optimal housing situations or even homelessness. And for businesses, schools, healthcare providers, and anyone else seeking employees, it means not being able to fill jobs because candidates can't find housing. And we're hearing, at least anecdotally, in the newspapers have covered this some, like people have finally land their dream job in Vermont. In our region, that often means you land the job in Vermont, but you're living in Massachusetts. Prior to the pandemic, though, the state invested in the development of resources for municipalities, realtors, developers, regional planning commissions, and others in the housing development chain to inform reforms to zoning bylaws that could better accommodate housing where it's needed, especially in our villages and downtowns. It's important to note that Vermont's overall development policy is to maintain this historic development pattern of compact settlement surrounded by countryside. Unfortunately, though, this policy is also repeated in other plans such as the State Comprehensive Energy Plan, Climate Action Plan, and Long Range Transportation Plan. With the ARPA funding, the state has provided municipalities with bylaw modernization grants as well as municipal planning grants, prioritizing the latter to focus on planning for the villages, downtowns, and related neighborhood development. The state's also made grants and loans available to towns for community wastewater and water planning and system development. And generally speaking, when we're talking new wastewater systems here, we're talking about distributed soil-based systems. There's also been a focus on serving all Vermonters with high-speed broadband, and hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested in that effort. That's important because we're seeing more and more people who already are here and who want to move here, who are increasingly working remotely from home. Now, one of the primary issues that I see is we can change the zoning, we can change town plan policy, but especially in our villages, and the vast majority of our villages do not have any kind of community water or wastewater. That is the primary limiting factor to housing development in those communities. Many of these villages are remarkably intact. They still have markets, hardware stores, banks, post offices, libraries, town offices, dining, lodging, and can be ideal walkable, bikeable neighborhoods, but for the fact that they're reliant upon on-site septic and well. And that means basically these villages are frozen in time. You really can't add a single dwelling unit to them. Let's say you wanted to add seating in one of the markets or country stores, you can't do that. Anything that intensifies wastewater use or drinking water use really can't be done because of lot sizes and the scale and the capacity of the existing wastewater and water systems. And so the message we've really been getting out to our towns, because a lot of them have been reaching out to us about housing, is that until we invest in the infrastructure to make compact settlement possible, it's going to be difficult to develop affordable housing at scale. And by at scale, I mean like 20 to 30 units at a time in all but a few communities in our region. And really where all the affordable housing is going, this is generally housing supported by our local housing trust, is in Brattleboro, Rockingham, and then some in Putney and some in Wilmington. And so the result also is that rural sprawl is going to be our dominant residential pattern for the foreseeable future until that wastewater investment's been made. And on a final note, I just want to talk a little bit about what some are referring to as climate migration. I'm participating in a National Science Foundation funded project at UMass Amherst, looking at how communities in the Northeast can be better prepared to receive climate migrants. And what I'm arguing is that in Vermont and Western Mass, we're already living the effects of migration, not necessarily climate migration, right now, primarily from the gentrifying leading edge. And we also need to recognize that what planners may think of as climate migrants, likely those climate migrants themselves don't necessarily recognize themselves as such. They may say they're moving away from months of smoke inhalation. It's been interesting to see the number of people we have moving here from the Western states, or they may be moving away from frequent flooding or unbearable heat. And one of the things I've advocated for, and I just want to mention this to this group, is that we inland planners would really greatly benefit from having a candid conversation with planners in northeastern coastal areas to get a sense as to how and where people and businesses, how you think people and businesses are going to move as sea level and groundwater rise, and how populations, businesses, industry, and everything shifts inland. Because my assumption is that you'll start seeing people retreating somewhat gradually unless we have something like another 1938 hurricane. And we should probably, here in Vermont, in our region especially, we're connected by interstate, we're connected by rail. And so we're anticipating a lot of what you would consider to be just kind of typical ex-urban growth. And like I say, we're already, I think, starting to see that, especially when I go down to Hadley, it looks very much like kind of commercial and residential expansion like you see elsewhere in the country. And gradually, I think we're seeing it come up I-91 and Route 9. So that's what I've got.
Thank you, Chris. We will move on to our next panelist, who is Jeff Levine of Levine Planning Strategies. So Jeff is the owner and principal of Levine Planning Strategies and has a wealth of experience with affordable housing planning. And he's going to speak about inclusionary zoning. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Katie. Can everyone hear me? I see some nods. Thanks so much, and thanks to HNRI for having me, and thanks to the speakers. It's been really interesting to hear what's going on elsewhere in New England. I always like to catch up, particularly some of the perspective from Vermont, from Chris. So thanks so much. At background, I'm really a local level urban planner, and that's really what I've done most of my career. So you'll see that I tend to bring that perspective to a lot of the work that I do. And it was a lot of it's been in Maine, but I also worked in Massachusetts for about 20 years. And I do have some Rhode Island connections. So I think of myself as a New Englander. So this type of presentation is really, really fun. Before I get into talking a little bit about the Portland programs, I just wanted to add a couple of things to what was said about LD 2003. I think Ryan provided a really good overview, and Aaron, two things I did want to mention that is part of that overall housing program is one, there is a grant program associated with it, the Housing Opportunities Program that will provide local governments resources to implement and to plan for housing. That should be rolled out in the next couple of months. The other piece that I think is important is there will be an effort to calculate the housing needs statewide and to allocate it regionally. So the idea of trying to figure out what is that number we're all trying for, none of it's perfect, but it is helpful to know the order of magnitude. So that's another piece of the overall pie that will be underway fairly soon. Just also to say that there's probably more on the way based on the results of the last election in Maine. I don't see this being the last word on housing at the state level. So keep your eye on what happens in the next couple of years as well. I think this was maybe just a starting point. It's also important to know communities have a lot of concerns about this, as was mentioned, but my response would be that if they plan for implementation, it will give them a lot of control over how it can apply. One of the examples is you can control your growth zones under Maine state law, and that does allow you to control where most of the growth will happen in your community. It doesn't allow you to say no to accessory dwelling units or second units, but it might help you concentrate some of the denser levels of development based on your local plans. I mean, at the core, it's really asking communities to just partner with the state and address this statewide need. So next slide. I want to focus for time mostly on inclusionary zoning and what's happened in Portland, but I do want to emphasize it's part of an overall set of housing policies. There's no, I think people ask me a lot, what can we do about housing in our community? And I think my first response is there's no one thing you can do about it. You have to look at the universe of options that are available as tools and figure out which ones work and realize no one of them is going to quote unquote solve your housing challenges. And that's true at the state level as well. So part of what I like about the model in Portland is that it was really seen as a comprehensive set of housing policies that really turned into a program. And it really coalesced, really over the last 15 or 20 years. But, it started with the federal programs in the 70s. The city's been working with those for a long time and using them to produce below market affordable housing. But really the first local movements beyond that were in 2002, when the city became concerned about housing being torn down and passed a housing preservation and replacement ordinance, which sort of mind-boggling to think about now, given how expensive housing is in Portland. But at the time, the concern was that housing units were being removed. And so it put a penalty in place. Basically, it said you had to pay a fund if you tore down housing units. They had to figure out where to put that fund, so they created a housing trust, although I'm not sure they knew that's what it was at first. And that was the origin of Portland's current Doosan Housing Trust. In 2003, the state created an affordable housing tax increment finance program that's a way of helping provide tax relief and operating subsidy for affordable housing. And Portland has 15 districts in place now. So that's also part of the sort of overall program that the city works on. In 2015, you get to the main event as far as this presentation is concerned. The city passed, as part of a set of changes, what was called the Insuring Workforce Housing Ordinance. This was part of a package called Encourage and Insure that passed some upzonings, but mostly focused on the goal of mandatory inclusionary development, so that new developments coming on board would have to provide affordable units. And at the time, it was what I like to call a starter program. It applied to 10 units or more and said that 10% of the units had to be affordable at 100% of median income. And that was partially a political decision based on what could pass at the time, and partially a sense of starting slow and feeling comfortable about where you were. Later on in 2019, the city passed a similar program for hotels. This might have been an impact fee or a linkage fee program, but based on the way that Maine state law works, it was actually passed as a version of inclusionary zoning that applied to hospitality, and said that for every 22 rooms in a hotel, you had to provide one below market affordable unit or pay the comparable fee in lieu. And given how many hotels have been built in Portland, that's actually been very successful even in the 3 or 4 years it's been in effect. Finally, I want to give credit to the current planning folks in Portland. They're doing what's called the recode. They're looking at the overall zoning code from top to bottom. So a lot of the time while I was there, we would sort of pick at pieces. We would do things like affordable housing overlays or upzone certain areas. They're taking the whole zoning code and looking at it from scratch. And I think, the timing of LD 2003 is pretty good in terms of fitting in with that. Next slide. So this is just a summary of what's happened under the inclusionary zoning ordinance as a whole. On the left, you see the residential developments that have occurred since it took effect. And on the right, you see the hotel developments. I left off the ones that have been approved, but I haven't moved forward yet because, until it's actually under construction, you don't know. That is available on the website, but I decided to focus on the ones where we were pretty sure the developments were happening. And first off, there was a lag because there was some political will to delay the implementation date. So although it passed in 2015, projects that had even applied to be approved at that point were exempted. So it really took about 18 months before you started to see projects for which it applied. And some of them provided on-site units initially, in part because they were the market they were looking for. A lot of the early developments paid fee and lieu's, which, for a program where you didn't have a lot of money in your housing trust was actually great. I know that communities like Cambridge and Somerville are looking to not allow fee and lieu anymore, but for a program like Portland's where it was in 2017, that was actually great. It helped capitalize the fund, and you could leverage that funding with other sources and really produce more units, honestly. I think there's started to be some response, as there have been in these other communities since that time, because there's actually a fair amount of money in the trust now, and there's a preference to get the units that maybe didn't exist at that point. In terms of looking at the hotel developments, just to point out, we expected everybody to do the fee and lieu option. Honestly, the main reason the actual provision of the units was provided as an option was to sort of fit it into Maine state law based on our lawyers' recommendations. So pretty much what you've seen is fee and lieu's from these hotel developments. And, there's definitely more in the pipeline, but I clipped it off at the ones that actually had happened. And, it's basically made, $750,000 of housing trust money out of nothing, because these hotels, for whatever reason, the economics of hotels is crazy. They seem to get back their money fairly quickly. And there seems to be an insatiable demand to build them. So, this is a way of getting money into the housing trust and also addressing the concern that hotels are taking up prime land that could be used for housing in the city. So you could outlaw hotels, I suppose, or you could leverage it for development like this. The last thing I'll say, because I know that we're a little short on time, is that this program, which I think, many developers felt was reasonable for a long time, sort of has gotten to an interesting point now. There have been 2 referenda in the last few years. related to this ordinance. And at this point, it now requires not 10% of the units be affordable, but a full 25%. And that's actually more than, as far as I can tell, any other community in New England. Burlington might have a 25% requirement. And the affordability is deeper, which actually I think is a good change, to 60 to 80% of area median income. But that 25% requirement, I think, was based on a little bit of what I consider a misguided sense that this was the tool to solve affordability in Portland. And instead, it's created a challenge in that, 25% of 0 is still 0, whereas 10% of 100 is 10. So is this going to discourage or stop new development in the community? And if so, maybe it's not going to work as intended. So far, I've actually been cautiously optimistic. It seems that there's still interest even with the higher requirement. But developers are much more willing to ask the city for concessions in return. So it's become very normal to bring in a standard housing development that would have been done entirely with private money 5 years ago and ask for a tax increment finance subsidy. And the response is because we need to meet the higher inclusionary requirement, and we can't do that on the free market. So, it's like a tool like any other, and you do have to think about what the right sweet spot is for it. But if you do, I think it's a really important piece of what you can use. With that, I think in the interest of time, I'll wrap up and look forward to any questions.
I actually have a question for you, Jeff. You said something on the last panel that I think probably would be useful to this audience related to the inclusionary zoning. And it was about how the market evolves and, in the early stages when it's first implemented, it's a cost that shifted to the developer. And you had some more comments about how it further shifts as the program matures.
Sure, thank you for reminding me of that. There is this question, and anyone who tries to introduce an inclusionary zoning ordinance will immediately hear from the development community that they can't bear the additional cost, that they support affordable housing, but their pro forma no longer works. They can't get investment with that additional expense. And I've actually done some work with the city of Malden, Massachusetts, modeling some of this with Colliers. So it is a interesting sort of place to figure out how does this fit in with an overall pro forma. And I think in the short term, you're right, Aaron, it does come out of developers' pockets to some extent because they've already put their deal together. The research shows that over time, however, what tends to happen, and there's mixed evidence on this, but this seems to be the leading sort of theory, is that what actually happens is land costs go down to absorb the cost of the inclusionary zoning. You might have someone who's been sitting on a piece of land for 50 years. Of course, they're going to get as much money as possible for it. But after inclusionary zoning becomes part of the landscape, as much money as possible is less money. So somebody who might have gotten a windfall of $10 million to sell a piece of land is getting $7 million. And the development moves forward relatively unscathed, I think. And I think that was starting to happen in Portland before the 10 went to 25. I think we're going through that again now as the market adjusts to the 25% inclusionary requirement.
Thank you, Jeff. Katie, we're, I think, past sort of our general chat. How would you like to proceed with the questions that we have?
So we have about 5 to 7 minutes for questions. So there's a few in the Q&A right now, and there's one which I actually, you may have answered this, Jeff, but there's a question from Scott Wolf. Are density bonuses a standard feature of the Portland inclusionary zoning program?
Good question. So there was a density bonus put into our inclusionary zoning program. It put in a baseline density bonus of 25% of your units simply for complying with the inclusionary zoning ordinance, which was a little bit of a coy way of upzoning without admitting it for large developments. And interestingly, no one blinked at it. The folks who were concerned about inclusionary zoning saw it as a way of, giving back to developers what was just taken away. And the folks who supported affordable housing said, great, more units is better. Honestly, the way the zoning works in Portland, it didn't have as much impact as you might think, but it was built into it. And I would recommend looking at that as part of an inclusionary zoning ordinance.
Thanks, Jeff. So we'll open it up to, these are questions that had come in a little bit earlier, and open it up to all of the panelists. Starting with Becky Marcus had asked a question, and maybe Katie, this might be a good question to start with you, but any recommendations for municipalities with scarce parking to begin with? Any success with incentivizing building parking lots that this has looked pretty expensive?
Katie, me? This Katie?
Yes.
Oh, that's, no, I would say at the municipal level, no. In fact, I think municipalities are incentivizing the provision of less parking when possible. It's certainly not addressed in the MBTA. Is the question that with the increased density will come an increased need for parking? Is that the idea? If it is, I mean, I think this was for, you know, the higher zoning, higher density zoning is supposed to be in close proximity to transit. And the whole idea is this is a bill that's addressing not just housing, but climate needs in the community, which will necessarily entail less, you know, less driving. So no, I'm not aware of, I can't respond to that. I'm not aware of that. Do you have any thoughts about that, Rachel?
I hear it come up on a case-by-case basis kind of thing, but largely I think Kitty's right. Most communities are considering right now whether they should be reducing parking. Will they have challenges doing so? We did have a community recently, Cambridge has taken away parking requirements. Yeah, I'm not hearing too much about it.
Yeah. Just one more thing on that point. You know, I think there was a lot of thought in the guidelines about parking requirements. And then I think it dawned on people that these guidelines and this new zoning is for decades to come. It's kind of setting the stage. And at some point someone said, well, will there be cars in 40 years? You know, I mean, you have to, it's sort of the long picture here. But it's a great question for your practical day-to-day reality.
Thank you. And there's a question from Scott Wolf that it looked like Erin Boggs, you had started to respond to, and other folks, this is a broader question around the support or resistance. How supportive or resistant have your state associations of municipalities and planners been to your proposals?
Yeah, I mean, I think we answered that a little bit in the session itself, but I do think among municipal, our Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, I think there's a lot of internal work that has been going on that's very good around racial equity issues and thereby connecting it to some of these land use issues. They're obviously an organization that's dealing with lots of members with lots of different opinions. And, I think they're making progress. I don't think, for example, they're going to support our bill this year, but I think they will be thinking about it. And I think there are some members who actually will end up supporting it.
So thank you, Erin. And this is a sort of a follow-up question, and I think it can go to anybody on the panel, but what suggestions do folks have from an advocacy viewpoint to pressure politicians and government officials to act in cases where it may not be felt they are acting fast enough?
One thing we are doing, I mean, obviously pointing out what's going on with the economy right now is going to be sort of one of the major things we focus on going into this legislative session. And the housing crisis, there was just an article that came out in a major paper here saying that half of the housing vouchers in the state were going unused because families couldn't find housing. I mean, it's a crisis, and we have to sort of convey that. We also have pulled the data for towns in Connecticut that are losing student population and have shrinking public school enrollment. And it's huge. I mean, there are towns that have lost over the last 10 years, 28% of their student populations, and you know, that trend seems to be continuing. And so helping towns understand that this is about their future and about their survival, I'm hoping will be persuasive.
Chris, did you want to go? I think Chris and I both have something to add there, but you had your hand raised.
Go ahead, Rachel, I'll follow you.
I was going to say, we're doing a lot of work to support communities in forming coalitions and bringing together broad groups of people that can really make the case for why housing is so important to everything, whether it's affordability, sustainability, economic development, diversity. And forming those coalitions is hugely important because it's really changing the tone in public meetings, where so often people who turn out are turning out because they're against something. And so to now have groups of people that represent broad constituencies talking about how this can help to preserve what we love, and then bringing that to the state level as well. And I say at the state level, we're having a lot of success right now, probably because the problem is so great and everybody's really feeling it. We're really encouraging, keep your foot on the pedal, keep going. You're doing good things. You're dedicating resources. You're changing zoning. We got to keep going.
I was just going to add that I think being candid is really helpful right now. It doesn't always work, but you know, frankly, just telling towns like, okay, if you're opposed to this housing, as you speak to the public, you know, I hear you. I hear that you're afraid that if you build additional housing, people you don't know will move there. And this can be this is a big issue everywhere. It's not unique to Vermont. I've dealt with it everywhere every jurisdiction I've worked in. But you know, noting that in pursuing this fear of the other, you're precluding housing for your own children, for your friends' children, for your parents, for the people who work in the stores that you go to. It's going to stifle economic growth and development, and that's the reality of it. So you got to have to make a decision if your fear of the other is really warrants making it impossible for anybody else to continue to live in your community. And I think another thing that we just need to be prepared for, and it's been interesting, the whole conversation around climate migration, and it may be an outsized discussion here because we're relatively rural and we've seen what happens when a relatively small number of people come to the state and it has an impact on the housing, is this whole climate migration discussion, because the Northeast is suddenly looking pretty good to people, whereas it used to be viewed as a place maybe to move away from. And you know, there's a real concern about this gentrifying leading edge that's going to actually displace other people from not just Vermont, but the region as a whole. And I think we just need to have some real candid conversations about that. And I hope that y'all down within the coastal regions are having more robust conversations about, like I mentioned before, how are people going to be moving as neighborhoods become uninhabitable, as drinking water gets impaired with saltwater intrusion, as groundwater begins to ruin all this good work we've done on brownfields with caps, as contaminants get pushed up. So hopefully you guys are having those conversations. I think we also frankly need to prepare, because of the just frankly political divisions in the country. I think there will be people seeking to move to the Northeast because of more restrictive political decisions being made elsewhere in the country.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to our panelists. There are still some questions coming in, and I just want to highlight there's some conversation in the chat related. There's a thread about conversion of vacant churches. There was some discussion around hotels and some commentary on accessory dwelling units and advocacy. I think that Melina Lodge is going to be able to address some of those in her closing remarks and talk about what is next and what we're doing in Rhode Island related to that. So I'm going to turn it over to Melina, but I also want to say we will try to address, get folks' questions responded to. Thank you. So Melina, go back to you.
Hi, how are you? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melina Lodge. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Network and the Community Housing Land Trust of Rhode Island. The Housing Network is the trade association of 16 nonprofit and community development corporations around the state. And we serve in an advocacy policy role on behalf of those partners. And the Community Housing Land Trust is a technical assistance for monitoring and preserving affordable housing stock. So those are the sort of two lenses in which we view our work. But I wanted to say thank you to the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston for letting us recast this event from an event that they hosted a couple of months ago that wasn't able to be recorded. Sharon Morris and Rachel Heller and Erin Cooperrider for helping navigate the conversation, and to our presenters for their really thoughtful dialogue around their programs and being willing to share. I think, and thank you to the attendees. I think we're going to attempt to answer any questions that don't get answered during this call, after the call in writing. We're also going to share around the recording so folks have that. And it is actually our desire to continue to host forums like this. So stay tuned on more for that. And if you have any suggestions for additional forums that would be informative, certainly feel free to email us. We are open to suggestions. So Kate, I think you can move to the next slide. I think, what I really heard as, I guess, the Rhode Island presenter in this space, our neighbors are a little further along than where we are, but I don't think that needs to impede us to imagine that we can get to where some of these other states are. So, but I think what is useful or affirming, depending on how you look at it, is that the challenges we're facing in Rhode Island are not isolated to us as a state, and I think all across the country, including our neighbors, are really all struggling to respond to the housing needs of its residents against a backdrop of shortage of housing supply and limitations of land use policy that make developing housing that we need really quite challenging. But what I do think, the benefit of all of this sort of negative airspace is that people are really paying attention to this issue and are rethinking how can we start to address these problems, because we aren't going to address new problems with old solutions. So I think we're seeing a lot of creativity, not only in New England, but nationally, around how can we take spaces, repurpose them, redefine them, and really just reconsider what we've always thought the landscape was. So obviously our partners today presented a few of those things, some of which I think are actually quite applicable within our state. Rhode Island is a very small state, which is actually quite diverse. We have rural, we have urban, we have in between. And so I think a lot of the presenters represent areas that are actually demonstrated in our very small landscape here. So what I think is that we are in a position right now where I think, we can make a lot of headway on our housing goals, but we do need to actually work together on this. I think state government, municipal advocates, and community partners coming together is really a critical part of how we're going to have these difficult dialogues, because they are going to be difficult. They will require, spaces and places to change a little bit to accommodate growth, and for that not to be viewed as a negative, right? But like, what are the enhancements to our communities when we can reimagine our spaces? So we have a couple of opportunities on hand right now. We just passed a budget with $250 million of ARPA funding for housing, which is really historic levels of funding for affordable housing. I think, what happens next will determine whether that historic investment has the chance to be, transformational to the housing sector. And if we're really able to make substantive headway on, our deficit of units. We have leadership right now. I think I saw Christine O'Connor from the Rhode Island Speaker's office on the call. I think she had to hop off. And the speaker has been very committed to moving housing policy, I think, through the legislature. And I think that is something that we have never seen, at least in my professional career in this state, and we would be wise to work collaboratively to do that. And I think the fact that we're small is actually an opportunity. I think when I talk to colleagues around the country, the idea that we can get together and have conversations and know people, I looked at the participant list, I know almost everybody on the call, which is a real asset. Actually, at the end of the day, we can connect to people and have these dialogues, which I think is something that we need to use to our advantage. We need to use data to drive policy and decision-making. I think, you know, when I listened to what the presenters were offering around what the data levels that their state has, how many units do they need for whom, Rhode Island can't clearly define at this point, how many units of housing do we need for whom and where. And so I think until we're able to really collect that type of information, we aren't going to be able to move to meaningful solutions. You can't solve a problem that you don't fully understand. And I think additionally, we need to really understand, I believe I saw a question about utility capacity, but I also know just conversationally, water sewer conversation comes up a lot. What are the capacities of water and sewer infrastructure? So I think for us to really move into a space of solving problems, we need to understand what are all of the needs that we have as a state, you know, that maybe don't have anything to do with housing, but are transportation or infrastructure supports that need to be invested in so that we can actually realize some of these more lofty goals that we have around development. I think approaching things as an or statement, right? We have to do this or this. These are really all and statements. We need to be doing a whole bunch of things at the same time, not necessarily choosing between them, and they need to work in tandem. And I think lastly, coming to discussions from a we can mindset is really important. I think a lot of times conversation is framed and centered in that's not what it looks like here. That's not how we've done it. We can't do that. And I think when we approach problems from that space, it sets the tone for that we likely won't be as open-minded and creative and collaborative as we can to advance our goals. I think it's important to say that, you know, there is no Rhode Island municipality who will meet all of its housing needs if it meets their 10% goal. So, I mean, that just goes to show that even when we meet the 10% goal, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. So I think it's finding ways to come together collectively to do that because everybody has a share in that. There is no one municipality that's going to solve this problem. It's really a piece for everybody to do. But with that, I'll leave if there's, I don't know if there's room for more questions or time, but with that, I'll wrap up and thank everyone for coming and certainly feel free to give us some feedback. And again, any ideas for future forums, we would love to hear from you.
Thank you. So I'm going to close out the webinar, but just want to echo the thanks, and we will be following up with everyone who registered with the recording notes and appreciate folks' time. Have a great day, everybody. Great rest of your day and evening. Thank you.
Take care.